Hello, and welcome to this University of Ottawa Press launch of an exciting new book by Dr. Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson. Lloyd is Vice President of Humanist Canada and lead psychologist at the Collaborative Centre for Justice and Safety at the University of Regina. He has been in private clinical practice for the past 40 years and has published on the structure of the self, self-construction, self-mapping in therapy, mimetic mutations in religious transmission, residential school syndrome as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, mind viruses, male stigma, and free will and psychotherapy. His exciting new book, The Evolved Self, Mapping and Understanding of Who We Are, will be of interest to psychologists, philosophers, sociologists, and really all who wonder how they came to define themselves the way they do. My name is Gus Lynn-Peluso. I'm the president of the Centre for Inquiry Canada. This chat will be about 45 minutes and will be followed by question and answers from the audience. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat box as we go on, or wait for the question and answers at the end and raise your hands raise your virtual hand so that we can unmute you. We'll get to them all at the end. Now, it is my great pleasure to be here with Lloyd and discuss the evolved self. Hey, Lloyd.
Thank you, Gus. Those are kind words.
Okay, so let's get right to it. Can you give us a quick summary of the evolved self?
Well, yes. What I've done, Gus, is I've developed a method of mapping the self. That's the self that is core to things like self-esteem, self-concept, self-actualization. And frankly, this had not been done before, and so it will be of use to psychotherapists of all schools of psychology. But in the course of the research, it developed into more than that. For example, using a historical lens, I concluded that the structure of the self that we can see and map now is possibly fairly recent as 3,000 years ago. In terms of evolution, that's a blink of the eye. But of course, I'm talking about cultural evolution here. It's a structure that we culturally learned to have, and now we transmit it onto our kids through the course of their upbringing, largely through language transmission and teaching. I've concluded that this self with this structure is found in different cultures, and that sort of fits with the evolutionary aspect of it. I would be very surprised if there was a culture where we did not have a self that was volitional and had a sense of uniqueness and had a sense of constancy, because societies that have a pre-modern self would have a difficult time competing. Okay, so where are we at with this book? It's of interest to anybody who has an interest in cross-cultural or the historical development of the self, and so on.
Okay, so I want to ask you about why you wrote this book, but specifically, what process did your self, the self that we call Lloyd, play in this process?
Okay, that's a good question, Gus. I had not thought of it. The self of myself, what process did it play in this? Well, I have mapped myself as part of practicing, and part of who I am is a person who inquires and has an interest in the world. And of course, I'm not unique in this. This is common. In terms of my inquiry, I wanted to know why people define themselves in the ways that they do. Now, I want to back up a little bit here and say that that's all true about myself and how I came to be interested in this, and that's true, but there's a very practical reason why I ended up doing this research, and that was had to do with a client. And the client was a female youth who had attempted suicide 5 times. And her therapist had basically did everything he could, everything he knew, and he referred her to me because he gave up. So I did what I do with people who have suicide ideation. I did cognitive behavioral therapy. I did eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I did some Adlerian psychotherapy. The client worked hard. She was compliant, but none of these methods that have been shown in the past have efficacy seem to work. So I could not refer her on, for one thing. This is a small northern community, and there weren't any other resources for another. If you keep referring clients like this, they soon learn to give up on themselves, and we didn't want that. So with an air of confidence that inside I did not really have, I said, well, let's find out what's blocking your progress in therapy. Let's create a map of yourself. And so I want to show everyone what we ended up with here. I'm going to share my screen. And I hope everybody can see that. And you'll see that what I did is I asked the client a whole series of questions to help define who she was, because often people do not define themselves. They say, this is what myself is. That's not a question most people ask. But how we usually define ourselves is in terms of when we're asked to do something, we say, oh, that's not who I am. Well, then you've just partly defined yourself in terms of what you're not. In terms of this young woman, this youth, what I found in developing this self is that the core of who she is depressed person. Now, supposing we put her on medication, antidepressant medication, and she begins to feel a little bit better about herself, what's going to happen to this self that she has constructed, albeit an adolescent self? It becomes less stable because it's not holding. Depressed person is the core of who she is. And and there's research to support this. Reflexively, she would lower her serotonin levels in order to escape that feeling of self-instability. That's my theory as to what happened. And it fits with what happened after that. Now, I want to point out that this was not her original self that I worked with. It shows as original, but you'll see that there's a meme here that says animal rights activist. That was actually a reframe of what she, my reframe to her, putting a positive spin on her becoming angry with people who are mean to cats and dogs. And when I say angry, she would become very aggressive about it. So with that reframe and the idea that we had to do something about depressed person and that had been the core of herself, we constructed a new center, a new core, and we named it human rights. And it's the idea of a human rights core seemed to link her feminism, her belief in Wicca, her being outspoken, and that was a reframe too, being empathetic, being an animal rights activist, and so on. And so we worked on strengthening that core while at the same time taking aspects of that supported her depressed self and challenging it. Like, for example, there was one that she's ugly. How do you know you're ugly? And actually, she was actually not ugly at all. And so we worked on that. We worked on other aspects, anger. Well, we found a use for that anger, and anger can be a very useful emotion in supporting things that you believe in. And so we shifted her anger over to this new core. And after about 7 months, we were able to have a self that looks something like this. You'll see that depressed person in this case has that whole section of herself has become much smaller. And the main part of herself now has become centered around her human rights core. And she received considerable support in her writing. She wrote poetry, she wrote prose, and she developed new friends, and was able to accept the idea that depressed person is no longer a way to define herself, but it's an emotion that everybody feels from time to time. And that's, of course, where we wanted to go. With that, and I did a pre-test, post-test in terms of the psychometrics of depression. She no longer scored depressed. She no longer scored suicidal. So we were able to terminate therapy, and she went on to do great things. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop the screen, and I'll tell you, I had something that worked. Okay, it only worked once, and so I had a sample of one. What's that? But I had a feeling that this was something important. So I decided, hey, I'm going to go back to university. I'm going to get my doctorate degree, and I'm going to study this this whole phenomena and see what we got. And that was what my doctoral dissertation research was all about, was mapping the selves of people in both collectivist and individualist cultures.
So her movement from the depressed self to the activist self allowed your inquiring self to take this further. Tell us about how this self-mapping methodology came to be. Did you develop it? Was it intended to fill a particular gap? And does it have any limitations, or what are the limitations?
Yes, I developed it. Now, with the suicidal youth, I actually modified an old life skills lesson called 10 Persons I Am. And I had her answer that, 10 persons I am. I had her answer, give me 10 things you believe to be true, 10 things you like about yourself, 10 things you would change about yourself if you could. And I had her rank order these. And we went through each one to ensure that each item that she's listing had, in addition to a referent word, it also includes a connotative meaning, emotion, and behavioral implications. If it had all of those things, I declared them to be a meme, with those memes that were ranked higher being more central to the core of who she is. That's basically how we constructed the map. Now, with regard to the doctoral research, my initial method could have prejudiced the presentation just by virtue of the kind of questions I asked. So instead, what I did with the doctoral research is I asked participants, the research subjects, I asked them to tell me who they were in narrative form, and then I would have prompt questions to make sure we had a very full explanation. Then I used a method of segmentation whereby we took core ideas from each sentence, phrases, and put each phrase into a bin with similar phrases, and determined whether they were memes from the characteristics in that bin. And we prepared maps that way. It was a bit more complex, but it was more pure research. Now, the basic limitation And it worked. We were successful in doing maps. And since then, I've done maps on clients. And quite frankly, I've used the 10 persons method, or actually now it's 40 persons method because it's quicker, but with similar results. And I could show you, in fact, in the books, there's maps of clients as well as participants showing how the structure works. Limitations, well, it's qualitative research. So we can't make generalizations. I can't say, for example, although hey, one of the people that I mapped that's discussed in the book was from the interior of China. Now, I can't say this is the Chinese self because I didn't do enough Chinese people to be able to say that. But I can say that, hey, this person from the interior of China who's raised traditionally in a collectivist society, her self structure had the same elements that people from North America, Caucasians from North America have, maybe with different emphasis, that's true. But there were social aspects of the self, there was volitional aspects of the self, the sense of the self was unique, emotive aspects, it was all there.
So perhaps implied in that is that there might be some biological or cultural constants component to that.
Well, yes. Now, in terms of culture, in terms of the cultural constants, I come to the conclusion that there is a difference between what we call collectivist and individualist cultures. Individualist cultures are basically descended from the European Enlightenment. And so they tend to be Euro-American cultures. And all the Enlightenment the Enlightenment didn't invent individualism. It just said, hey, the self, which we have, the individualism has been ordered and repressed through things like religion. All they did is said, they declared the individualism that was already there to be a good. In collectivist societies, there is an ideological imperative that the self has to be kept in its place. That is, people are not allowed to endanger the collectivity. So that is a difference, but that doesn't mean that there's a difference in the self. It's just about a difference in how the self is treated.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay. So memes come into this, and I really want to understand this. So a meme, the way I understand it, is a unit of cultural production, something that's out there in the world that then becomes viral and in some way, shape, or form infects us in some way. How does that process go from being out there to helping myself evolve or to creating myself?
Okay. One thing I want to correct you on a little bit there, Gus, because you're using a common, and hey, Richard Dawkins is the original guilty party, but others took Susan Blackmore did this in spades, and that is she viewed memes to be like a virus. Memes can be like a virus, but not necessarily. In terms of virus is something that infects. What does the meme infect? Well, in a simplistic way, it infects the body. That's what Blackmore said. Well, I don't agree with that. Memes would infect a structure that is already there, that is mimetic, because memes are a cultural phenomena. Specifically, and I agree with Dawkins on this, his original definition was the smallest unit of culture that is self-replicating. Okay, if that's a unit of culture and it's infecting somebody, what are they infecting? They're infecting the self, which itself is a collection of memes. Now, how did that come to be? In terms of evolution, the self didn't could not have arisen all at once. It wasn't suddenly there in its full-blown form. It's something that would have evolved piece by piece. So what I'm describing is a self that is a fairly recent, and it could have been older than 3,000 years, but it's fairly recent. There would be selves that existed prior to that didn't have all the capacities that our fully evolved self has, and this is not to say it can't evolve further. In fact, it quite likely will. But the pre-modern self would have had aspects of itself, and probably, well, some people have dated the self as being like 40 or 50,000 years old. Well, yes, that's defensible, but it's not the same kind of self that we have today.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. Gus, did I answer your question? I sort of went around it.
I think you did, but we might come back around to it. So given the history of Canada and its treatment of Aboriginal peoples of this land, what insights does this study teach us about the Aboriginal self? And further to this, I would guess that other Aboriginal psychologists would have a somewhat less scientific and materialist approach than you. Is this so, first of all? And if it is so, why? Tom Strong from the University of Calgary disagrees with your notion of the development of the self. Yet he has written favorably about your book. What's this disagreement about? And what is the common ground between you two?
Okay, well, Gus, you've asked several questions there.
Too many at once. Okay.
So I'm gonna try to dissect it a little bit. First, you're correct. Most the general thread of psychologists who work with data studies departments with First Nations University is that there is an essential Aboriginal self. I disagree. By essential, that means that there's an Aboriginal self that is pre-colonial that we have to get back to, and if we don't get back to it, then we're unhealthy because we're not acknowledging who we are in some sense. That is the prevailing ideology. My first reply to that is that we can't possibly know what Aboriginal self, or selves, plural, looked like pre-contact. The culture was not written down. The exploration of the self was not done. So we're guessing. And that's my first response. But I want to read you, you're right, by the way, in the assumption behind that question, I want to read you a quote from an Aboriginal psychiatrist who wrote a book called Coyote Healing. You may have heard of it. This is from Louis Malmadrana, and he wrote, he's also a medicine man. And as well as a psychiatrist, he writes, my teacher reminded me that 70% of healing is a person's decision to be well. 20% comes from God and the divinely inspired personal transformation, and 10% is the show that the medicine man puts on to make people think something happened. Well, I've watched medicine men in action, and I agree, there's a certain showmanship about it. I definitely do not agree that there is magical or divinely inspired a process here, but I do agree that there's an internal process whereby people can become healthy. But obviously, well, maybe it isn't obvious, but my more scientific materialist perspective is a little bit different than Lewis's. I want to show you what he wrote about me, and then I'll talk a bit about it. I'm going to share screen again here, and hopefully that will work. Okay, here is Dr. Malmadrana, and here is what he wrote. And he says that I present a fascinating exposition on the concept of self in relation to mainstream and indigenous concepts. So he acknowledges that I'm drawing on in indigenous history, culture, and teaching here as part of what I add to the book. And then he concludes at the bottom of this that his work is original and inspiring. Thank you, Lewis, and can lead us to a better understanding how we come to believe in who we are. What is Lewis saying here? Lewis is saying that he draws on a certain tradition, and his tradition, that his perspective is a little bit different than mine. But he's saying that this is a perspective, and a perspective that I'm presenting that is worth pursuing from the Aboriginal lands. Now, in my book, I use that I use what Lewis is representing as Aboriginal spirituality lowercase. Why do I say lowercase? Because this application of Aboriginal spirituality does not involve a set dogma. It's not a religion, but it may invite some religious-like or spiritual experiences that Lewis uses in his work, but he is open to change with more evidence. Now, also in my book, I also use the term Aboriginal spirituality capitalized. And that is more like a religion, because there we have an essential belief system, and if you don't follow it, then you're viewed to be unhealthy in some ways, or less Aboriginal in some ways, perhaps. That is a distinction that I would make, and so I'm arguing for an Aboriginal spirituality that is not religious. And now you also asked about Tom Strong, and this is actually similar as well. Before we get to Tom Strong, here is a map of an Indigenous Cree person, and you'll notice that at the center part of the map, and you'll notice that, first of all, the maps have gotten more sophisticated since my initial map with suicidal youth. In this map, there is a thick black line that starts from a meme called Rememberer. It's actually a meme and a theme called Rememberer, and it's the initial stories he told to describe who he was, and they arrive at the same conclusion, or at the conclusion that he's an active animator doer kind of person. That is core to who he is. Then there's another thread. The memes can be viewed as the highlights of a story, or that we tell about ourselves, and so you can trace a story from that he concerned himself about humanism, and you can trace that through being Aboriginal, being what do we got here? Being a protector, being a parent, being healthy, and so on. There's another story, a narrative that he tells. Then you will see that in blue on the outside here, you have Aboriginal spiritualist, and you have Taoism. Taoism he learned in his late teens when he was studying martial arts, and he incorporated that as one of his spirit helpers. In his early 20s, he decided, well, I'm a big Indian. What is that? And so he decided to learn about Aboriginal spirituality. And he went on sweats. He went on a vision quest, and he became a drummer. All of which added to his self. But you'll notice it was added later. It's not really his core at that point. Now I'm gonna, you asked me about Dr. Strong. This picture of Dr. Strong is an old one, but I like it. I got to tell you that Dr. Strong was on my dissertation committee. And I think what you asked had to do with his view of the self, and he viewed the self, he's a narrative therapist. Narrative therapy is based on a postmodernist idea that we are the stories we tell yourself. So the example of the map that I just showed you, Trevor had several narratives. When asked who he is, he would follow the different memes, and that created a narrative, a story. And we followed one that led to his animative self, and another that was started with his reflections on a humanistic self. These were, and this fits with Tom's view. And so one of the reasons this works in narrative therapy, in fact, I think it's a big reason, is because in order to work with clients and do good with clients, we need to believe the clients. Narrative therapy, based on postmodernism, says that truth is in the beholder. We create our own reality, and so whatever the client's reality is, we go with that, and it works to an extent. I would argue it does not work at the societal level very well, but at the individual level, it does. In my approach to therapy, I use that, but not exclusively. I also teach my clients to be good scientists. So as with the suicidal youth, I challenged her to investigate certain beliefs she had. What evidence do you have, one way or the other, in order to validate or to change those beliefs? Okay, I think I've answered your question. What did I miss here, Gus?
Well, first of all, that was fascinating. Do you have any insights about the Aboriginal self? Have you learned anything about, or might we be able to generalize from the Aboriginal clients you had, like maybe with the one from mainland China?
Okay, I actually did a journal article on the Aboriginal self, and I examined 4 selves, and I map out a spectrum. Trevor's in there, the one I just showed you, but there are other selves as well. There's one whose pseudonym was Tina. Was it Tina? Anyway, herself, she grew up in a Métis community. She still lived in a Métis community. She never left it. Yet there was nothing in herself that was a marker of Aboriginality, as Trevor achieved when he studied Aboriginal spirituality. So what there is a spectrum of possibilities. And depending on how you define Aboriginal, one person with Métis heritage did not define herself as Métis because she did not learn or practice Métis culture. That's a cultural definition of Aboriginality. Today, in today's world, we use a more genetic definition of Aboriginality. You have to have a certain amount of Aboriginal genetic heritage, that is Amerindian heritage, to be Aboriginal. We tend to use that genetic definition, and using that genetic definition, then there is no real Aboriginal self. It's whatever Aboriginal people choose to add to their self, and some of them may not have any markers of Aboriginality at all. It's still an Aboriginal self using a genetic definition.
Oh, so is there any particular thing that you learned about working with Aboriginal clients? In other words, how could you, is there anything specific to use with Aboriginal clients?
With respect to the self, or
with respect to the self, yes. I mean, would you said you would encourage them to be more scientific. Would you encourage them to look into their cultural history?
That's entirely up to them. See, my approach lends itself to treating each client as a culture of water, because I like to see, in fact, everybody. This is part of the structure of the self. We see ourselves as unique, even if we can't put a finger on what it is about us that is unique. And so, with respect to things like history, culture, heritage, these can be very important things. And yes, for someone who has an interest in doing that, I would encourage them, explore your interest. But I'm not going to tell in this case, the woman in the example I gave you, okay, you don't have any markers of Aboriginality, so there's something wrong here. You need to work on this. I would never, ever say that. Now, what happens with culture and modern cultures is we're exposed to many memes that are not strict. Trevor, one of the things that he talked about and believed in is Sun Yat-sen's I'm not sure I've got the name right. His dictum that no battle plan ever survived first contact with the enemy. That particular dictum, well, it's originally from Asia, although it was replicated in Europe by some German general at some point. I forget his name right now. That particular dictum in my research came up identically with a person from Vancouver who was not Aboriginal. He was Caucasian. Both of them were borrowing from an Asian history. Now, that's our modern world. We have the far greater ability to create our own selves, and by creating our own selves, I'm going to stop share here because I think we've exhausted Tom. In terms of ourselves, we can now draw on heritages from all around the world and decide what makes sense for us. Because in the end, what we incorporate into who we are has to feel right.
So sounds like it's a movement towards a cosmopolitan self.
Well, yeah, except I would say cosmopolitan selves, because there's a huge variation of possibilities. Now, most people who are of Aboriginal ancestry will be interested in that ancestry. And so one of the problems we have, and this is not something I really touch on in the book, but one of the problems that we have, okay, I hold, and this is my reply to Tom's assertion in one of his writings that science is a white male way of knowing. I hold that that's not accurate, that science is not a way of knowing. Science is a method of reducing our subjectivity and determining objective evidence in order to make new conclusions. And that particular method is not restricted to white males. It's open to everybody, regardless of culture, regardless of gender. Now, in terms of self-construction then, having a respect, we all tend to be scientists to at least this degree. When we want or looking, and then psychotherapists find this almost universally, people resist change. Why? Because it doesn't feel true. Okay, I'm working with someone who has low academic self-esteem. They believe they believe they can't learn. And I say, well, wouldn't you be better off if you believed you could learn? Yeah, I would. Why don't you just change it? Well, it's wrong. It's false. It's not who I am. They're really obliquely appealing to an objective criteria. They're saying objectively, if it's wrong, if I'm just lying to myself, if I'm fooling myself, that doesn't feel very good. So all of us rely on some method of determining what is objectively true, at least at that level.
Right. Right. All right. Well, sorry. Okay. Speaking of the scientific approach, you are obviously a more scientifically minded psychotherapist. Yet, when I take a look at your work, to me, it seems very artistic too. Can you help us unpack that? Are you an artist or are you a scientist in your work with clients?
Rarely have I been accused of being an artist, but psychology has been described as both an art and a science, and that's true, and I can follow that. It the practice of psychotherapy has been largely based on an idea, on a model of what constitutes a fully functioning human being. I assert in my book that that model is the self that evolved. Now, the self that evolved, we define ourselves. In fact, Homo sapien means a wise person. It basically means we're thinking and rational beings. That's how we define ourselves. The determinists would say, bullshit. We're not rational. We just think we are. That's an illusion. We're wholly determined by our genetic and environmental inputs. And if we do all of the genetic and environmental inputs, we'd be able to tell what you're going to do next, Dr. Robertson. That's exactly what they say. That's a hard determinist position. And I say, yeah, you're mostly true. You're mostly correct, but not totally. The woman from that I mapped from the interior of China, who went by the pseudonym Ma Mao, she described herself as a robot. She said that she had learned to obey the command, to wait for the command and obey. And that had been true from her earliest memories onward. Went to university. Her parents told her what she was going to take. She wasn't particularly interested in it. She would rather have studied astronomy, but hey, she follows the command. She decided she didn't like being a robot, and she decided to start making her own decisions. Now, here's what she did. For each decision, including when to get up, what to have for a meal, whether to go to university that day or not, she did lists, and she did pros and cons, and because the lists aren't absolute, she had to weight them with vectors in order to make a decision. And she came back and she said, making your own decision is too much hard work. I'm going to go back to my old self and just wait for the command, because hey, I got other things I want to do.
Right.
Very good point.
Right.
And the fact is, none of us, or very few of us, I don't know of anybody who lives life that way for very long. What we end up doing is we end up making decisions not based on evidence, but on heuristics. We do things based on what we've done in the past, or what the advertisers tell her, or what our grandfather used to do, or various ways that we get around having to make our own decisions. We have the capacity for free will when we want to exercise it, but that's rarely. And so that is my compatibilist explanation, is that we're mostly determined beings, but we have the capacity, because we're able to imagine it now that we have a self that is capable of imagining it, of acting differently. As Dawkins said in his book, we can act differently from the dictates of our genes and our means. Right. Yes, we can, but rarely.
Right. Okay, we're down to only a few minutes, but I have one more question that I really want to get to. Can you give us some quick advice for therapists who want to make practical use of your insights?
Oh, quick advice for therapists. Well, hey, read my book. My daughter and I, my daughter is a psychologist, practicing psychologist at Edmonton, and we are working on developing a manual for therapists that will make the job easier. But for the time being, yes, you can follow my method and play with it and develop by hand maps of your clients, and you may find one of the things I find that's incredible when working with clients is that once they see a map of themselves and it resonates with them, they start generating their own changes without me making suggestions. It follows. They see the self, they say, okay, I can do this. I can, and because they're generating their own therapy, their own homework assignments, if you will, they're more likely to follow it. It's an amazing tool.
There's something about seeing it that externalizes it, and then they can say, I want to make this change and that change.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, let's move on to the question and answers now. I think we're going to unmute people. So if anyone wants to ask a question, raise your hands. But while we're doing that, we have a question from Marty, and he says, your work with Indigenous people indicates that natural phenomena like animals, plants, trees, used to explain their concept of self more than urbanized Europeans. They named themselves this way. How about the self concept?
I'm not entirely sure I understand that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
There's reference to
maybe Marty can join us and explain it.
Yeah, but let me talk a little bit about the natural phenomena. There's plenty of research, and this is my own experience, is that Indigenous people have an affinity with nature, with the land. And one of the things I have done in my practice up in northern Saskatchewan with a lot of people is, okay, you're having difficulties here in town. Why don't you go on the trap line for a few days and by yourself and do some fishing, do some hunting, and think about things. Hey, that has been therapeutic for a lot of people. Now, but I should explain to the listeners that a trap line in northern Saskatchewan, most families that are Indigenous have a traditional area of land that they have been able to trap for furs, and that's a family area, and so that's a trap line, and hey, it's a great way of getting back to nature, and if we can think in terms of a secular spirituality, this could be it. It's a way of everybody that I mapped that had a healthy functioning self. One of the things that they believed in was they wanted to believe in something bigger than themselves. Now, that does not have to be religion. It could be nature. One person said it's the universe, but or it could be the family, or the community, or the human race. Something bigger than themselves, and they're working to make the world a better place as a result. That is an important part of having a healthy, functioning self. Now, in terms of Indigenous people, we have that history that we can draw on, and it's a connectivity. With regard to the practice of science, because science has modern scientific methods have been European, that connection isn't as readily there. We need to find ways of making that connection in terms of Indigenous education and Indigenous therapy.
Timothy, would you like to ask your question live? Not sure if Timothy has a mic.
Sure, I can do that.
Go ahead, Timothy.
So you've mentioned your notion of self being stable across cultures, but then you've also implied that it's malleable in as much as you're using it in psychotherapy. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to sort of what's stable, what's fluid, and sort of how much your map sort of is indicative of this.
Okay, good question, Timothy. I'm glad you asked it. The stable part in the healthy self, there are certain elements that are there, and this is cross-cultural. And the elements include things like volition. Even if volition is not valued in the culture as it was in the case of Mau Mau, her own volition was not valued, it's still there. She has that capability and capacity. There's plenty of other research that indicates that cross-culturally, things like free will, a study of 30,000, a sample of 30,000 people, students actually in Hong Kong, showed that the majority had a belief in their own capacity for free will. This is a collectivist culture. My gosh. So those kinds of things, collectivity, we're social beings. It doesn't matter what culture we're from. We need to express our identification with our social selves in certain ways. It could be through family. People who can't express themselves through a collectivity, they don't do well emotionally. Now, what is that's what the structure then is the same, but the components, the actual means that go into the structure, they can vary all over the place. And so I hope I didn't get the impression that there's no such thing as an Aboriginal. There is memes that are identified with Aboriginality. But here's how fluid, Timothy, this is how fluid the self can be. One of the people that I met had a self that ended up looking very much like Trevor's self. Trevor, you recall, was the young Cree man. This guy's a bit older. He was in his 50s, actually. And his self looked very similar, including the aspects of Aboriginal spirituality. The one thing that was missing from his self that was different from Trevor's self is this person's did not identify with Taoism. But other than that, very similar self. Genetically, this person is 100% Caucasian. He happened to marry a Métis woman, lived in northern Saskatchewan, and adopted a northern cultural and its northern self. Now, did this person identify as an indigenous person? No, but hey, his self is virtually indistinguishable from Trevor's self. That's how fluid the self can be.
The self can't be guilty of cultural appropriation then?
Well, that's a whole other political question, Gus.
I resisted asking that for a bit, but I couldn't help it.
I'll tell you, from my studies of culture, that's how cultures grow and develop. All cultures appropriate from other cultures, and the selves appropriate from whatever sources are there in the community that they come into contact with, and they incorporate that which makes sense to them. And what makes sense to them will largely be the self or proto-self that is already there. Although that can change too. So yes, the development of the self is a matter of appropriation, and we appropriate from whatever cultural influences that we have before us.
Michael, would you like to ask your question live, please?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Lloyd, your maps have the potential to document additional parameters of the self, such as intensity of trait, strength of links, and so on. Have you envisaged developments in that direction?
We're working on it, Michelle. Here, I'm going to show you another map, if that's okay. Okay, this is the map of a Cree woman from northern Saskatchewan, and you'll notice that we've incorporated into the self other aspects: work, husband, family. These are all the dividing line between the self and other outside aspects is diffuse. It's not clear where a person ends and their family begins or their work begins. Now, you'll also notice that we've incorporated into this self a menu of emotions that trigger various aspects of herself or various presentations, and sometimes her depression and anxiety, which I was treating her for, would trigger this aspect of herself called we've labeled the imperfect self, and she would ruminate about her imperfections, which of course would deepen her depression. Here, this is after therapy for a period of time. The memes here marked in yellow are memes that built her sense of volition, her sense of self-empowerment. The ones in blue are modifications to her imperfect self that basically allowed herself to say, yeah, I'm imperfect, but that's okay. So I agree with you, Michelle. The idea of the self maps can be really quite flexible and can represent all kinds of information, all kinds of new information, some of which I have not used yet, like the aspects that you were suggesting. Remember, a map is never the total terrain. It's like a road map. It represents some of the terrain, and hopefully we get enough of it right that we can use it to plan our journey. But it's not going to represent every hill, every bump, and it's not going to, and it depends on the purpose of the map too. There are road maps, there are topography maps, they look different. And they all are useful for the purpose that they're designed for. And so, yes, there's going to be, I think, quite a lot of potential to develop these maps further.
Okay, but currently, essentially, the maps as they stand are good enough for the purpose, in effect.
That's correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have one more question that I missed earlier on, and that's, are you familiar with the book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind? And if so, did it impact on your work?
Yes, I am familiar with that book. And yes, it impacts. Now, the author there is looking at, as I'm trying to recall, he's looking at early pre-Homeric Greek history. And he's suggesting that, and by pre-Homeric, he's looking at maybe 2,500 years ago. And he's suggesting that that pre-Homeric Greeks did not see the world or view the world in the same way that we more modern humans do. And here I'm defining humanness culturally, in terms of the self. And so what he was basically saying was that when the culture would have a range of responses to stimuli, and when an event happened, the culture would tell them what program to implement to respond to that challenge, whether it be strangers coming into town or into the community rather, or shortages of food. There'd be a cultural response to that. And when there was a challenge or an event or a stimuli that happened that the culture did not prepare them for, then in terms of in psychological terms, they wouldn't know what to do. And the right brain, in this case, would have visions, and they would interpret these visions as being messages from the gods, and they would then try out whatever the message was, and if it worked, it became part of the cultural repertoire, which would then be passed on through mimetic imitation, and if it didn't work, well, hey. It would be lost, and often the people would be dead. So culturally, those were the options. Now, it's been some years since I've read that book, but obviously it had an impact, and yes, it fits with the theory of the self that I'm talking about. The self that Julian Jaynes was describing was pre-modern, but it was still a self. But it didn't function in the same way that we expect our modern selves to function.
Okay, well, we've reached the time limit, and we've had some great audience questions. I just want to give you a chance now to add. Is there anything you'd like to add to this? Anything we didn't get at? You want to tell us about the book specifically?
Oh, Gus, thank you for doing this. I want to thank you once again for being here. I think the book has a lot of implications. One of the things we didn't touch on, for example, in terms of the self, is talk about this. Well, I mentioned it already. The tension between the collectivist and individualist, and that tension is within each one of us. There's a tension between when we want to act collectively for the group and when we feel a need to act individually. And so the tension between collectivist societies and individual societies is already there and is going to be there regardless. In terms of postmodernism, I trace that back further than some who reference, say, Foucault or Derrida. I trace it back to Martin Heidegger. And here's a final message I want to give. Heidegger, of course, was a Nazi. He was also a very good philosopher. And he did a marvelous job in Being in Time on deconstructing, if I can use that postmodernist term, deconstructing science and reason. But he was not a relativist. He believed that it's possible to see beyond science and reason, and that's where the title of his book came from, Seeing the Past, Present, and Future Simultaneously. And he used a German word, Dasein, which doesn't exactly mean that in German. It actually just means being there, but he used it idiosyncratically, and he said himself and the Fuhrer were Dasein. My idea that I want to leave you with is that postmodernism is inherently unstable. You can't run a society like that because you have to have some basis of agreement. So if you're not going to use science and reason to generate that basis of agreement, what ends up happening is different people become Dasein, and they define what reality is. And I think we're seeing some of the effects of that in today's identity politics now.
Oh, fascinating. Well, Lloyd, I really want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this, but particularly for writing The Evolved Self and for doing all the work you do, for all the work that you do in making this world just a little bit more just and humane. And I also want to thank the University of Ottawa Press for bringing us this great book, and thank our participants today, and to let you know that you can benefit from a 20% discount for this book from the University of Ottawa Press. You can go to their website and put in the code. The code was in your invitation, and you'll also receive an email tomorrow about this. So again, thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I know you'll enjoy reading The Evolved Self.